Hi, everyone. I am Versha Sharma, the senior correspondent at NowThis, and we're here this morning with Satjeet Kaur, the executive director of the Sikh Coalition in the United States. But we're here to talk about a global movement. If you haven't seen the news, if you've maybe been hiding under a rock or hibernating under the last few weeks, there are huge protests that have been going on in India for weeks and even months now. And most recently, at the end of November, there was actually a 1 day strike where 250 million workers in India were estimated to go on this 1 day strike, which many are saying is the largest strike in world history. Now, the movement is continuing and it has solidarity protests all across the world, including here in the US. So, we're here today to talk about what's happening, why it's happening, and why people should care about this and pay attention to it. So, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Versha. I really appreciate you having us and sharing more about this large global movement.
Now, can you just kind of give us a rundown of how this started and the main causes of it?
Yeah, so in September, the Indian government passed three new agricultural laws or that bills that impact agriculture specifically, with minimal inputs from the farmers that would be affected. And as I'm sure you know, agriculture is the primary source of livelihood for over half of India's population. And just to put that in perspective, that is twice the size of the United States population. And for the vast majority of those farmers, they're small scale farmers. Occupying, about 5 acres or less of land. So, this is a bit, these bills not only affect a vast majority of Indians, um, but it also just impacts agriculture as a whole around the world, because India produces so much of the world's agriculture for food, for medicine, spices, all of it. So it's just really important for us to be paying attention to why they are so upset with these bills.
Now, what has been the response of the Indian government so far? We have Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who's been in charge now for a number of years. And I understand in some cases, local authorities cracked down harshly on some of these protests. We've seen some of that happening, but the protests are continuing, right? The farmers and the workers aren't giving up. So, what has the response in the back and forth been?
Yeah, so it's important to note that these protests actually didn't start at the end of the November. Farmers have been protesting these bills since September when they were passed, and even others objectifying to the potential of them passing earlier than that. But they went unheard in their home state. So they were protesting locally and they went unheard. And that's why there was this large movement of farmers, specifically from Punjab, Haryana, and some of the other states, to move the protests to Delhi. And as they were moving towards Delhi in the end of November, yeah, they were met with tear gas, water cannons, violence, and the right to protest, the right to dissent, especially in one's own capital, is a marker of democracy. And if India calls itself the world's largest democracy, it's really critical that those protests be allowed to happen and be met peacefully. And that was not the case. And that's actually what inspired that large strike that you were mentioning at the very beginning of the conversation, and what has inspired such a large global response to make sure that the world knows that we're paying attention to this, because it is about human rights, it is about civil rights, and it is about economic rights and having equity.
Now, I think you just made an important point, which is that it's been since September and even earlier than that, and of course, it's been dominating the news in India as it should. But it's taken some time to reach Western media, and sort of like the conscience of people who are here in the United States. But there are solidarity protests that are happening here. I think your coalition told us that there were protests in 13 states as well as Washington D.C. recently. So there are thousands of Americans who are protesting in support of the farmers. So what can you tell us about what's been happening in the U.S.?
Yeah, and those numbers are rising. I think we're like 15, 16 if we start talking about protests that are even happening this weekend. So um, uh, the solidarity movement is really important, and Sikhs, especially across the world, have been leading out on these solidarity protests in response for a couple of reasons. So I'm going to start with why Sikhs have been leading out on this. Is one, Sikhs have been known to always stand against injustices. So whether it is serving people during a pandemic or ensuring that farmers' rights are protected across the country, it's our duty to serve stand in solidarity and to protect and protest against injustices. But the second reason is that the farmers' protest really hit close to home for all of us. The key started in Punjab. Most of our community lives in Punjab, in present day India specifically. And so when you talk about Punjab, you're talking about what is known as the breadbasket to India. And when you come for that community, especially when you come for us, we have ties to agriculture, we have ties to farming. So when you come after that livelihood, you are coming after the entire community. And so it's just really important to understand why Sikhs, especially from Punjab, are in the forefront leading, not just locally in India, but across the globe, because it matters that much, standing against injustices, but also making sure that our community is protected and that our livelihoods are protected. And then more often, more importantly, why other people should really understand and care about what's happening and why they've joined into these solidarity protests. It's because, one, as I said in the beginning, whether you're American or whether you're someone from around the world, you enjoy Indian food, Punjabi food. You are participating in purchasing basmati rice from your local Costco's. You put turmeric in your chais and have chai tea lattes or golden lattes, right? Like, these are the things that we have enjoyed on the backs of Indian farmers. So for us to understand what is happening to those individuals, what is happening to their livelihood is really critical, and to be able to make smart assessments about it. Agricultural experts, economists, and most importantly, the farmers themselves are saying that they're not okay with this, and it's important for us to listen and to amplify those voices. And I think the other part that's really critical to understand about this movement, it is about moving against corporate interests. It is about understanding when we create a larger divide between the everyday person and the uber rich, we're creating larger issues that manifest in ways that we may not even understand just by the passing of these laws. Social justice isn't just about being nice to one another. It's really about having equity. And you can't have equity when bills and laws are being passed only to serve corporate interests. And that's why really understanding these movements is just so critical.
I was just going to ask you if you could kind of speak to why the Parliament of India and the Modi government has been pushing this legislation. And I believe, as you said, it's part of like a larger movement under the Modi government to privatize certain industries to serve more corporate interests rather than workers and labor interests. Do you think that that's an accurate kind of summary?
I think it's really important for us to just look at what's happening on the ground, right? You see the everyday farmer saying that they are not okay with this, and then you do an assessment on who's saying it is okay. I think we can make those assessments for ourselves. And so if we again just look at who's on the streets, the nearly million people that are at the outskirts of Delhi, because they're not even allowed into their capital, right? Like, think about that. They're not even allowed to protest inside their capital. They are outside Delhi. But it's also really interesting to see how they're responding. So not just why they're protesting, but even how they are protesting, because I think that gets into the inequities that we're talking about. Despite what the media says, these protests are peaceful, and they embody the concept of seva and selfless service to a T. There is free food being set up, and it's not just for the protesters, it's for all the people in the neighboring villages. Some kids have actually said to media folks that this is the best that they've ever eaten, and they hope the protests never go away. And that says something, right? That says something about the economic inequities that they're living with. There's menstrual products being distributed for free. There's centers set up for prayers for people of all different backgrounds. There are gyms set up. They even started their own media publication. And I think, a really interesting marker, Delhi had a blood shortage a couple of weeks ago, so I heard. And they even set up a blood bank and helped fill that blood shortage. So you have protesters that are not just saying that we don't stand for a further divide of economics and class, but they're saying we know how to counter that, and that's what we're doing. And I think it's really powerful to honestly see, again, not just what they're protesting, but how they're protesting it. And I hope that inspires all of us, because it's a statement to say that when we come together, stand in solidarity, really meet each other's needs, we can do better. and we should do better.
Yeah, that's incredible. I didn't know those details about some of those protests and community work going on the ground there. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. What do you think has motivated people here to pay attention to it and also organize protests in the United States?
Yeah, and again, I think it goes back to that strong connection, especially Punjabi Sikhs feel, because it is our brothers and sisters, it's our families, it's our elderly, our Buzurg that are in India, in the cold. It's like really cold in India right now, and just to like understand that, and the fact that we can't do that with them, like how do we respond and how do we show solidarity to make sure that they know that we stand united with them, and so that has sparked these protests locally and rallies here. Again, they've been really peaceful, really getting to the anti-democratic response that India had, the government had shown these protesters in the beginning, and as new protests have emerged, encouraging India to pay attention to their needs, let's amplify their voices and make sure that they are heard. And it's also really important that lawmakers here and in other countries know that when we are talking about trades with one of the largest countries in the world, what does that mean for your constituents and how do they actually feel about those things? So again, just putting our lawmakers on notice as to what is going on in India, something that they may not know about. And these rallies are also a way of doing that and motivating them to make public statements as well.
Yes, I think for those of you who are watching, you were seeing a little bit of the Sikh Coalition website just there, and you guys have a great, easy to use tool on your website for contacting members of the U.S. Congress. Can you talk about what specific kind of advocacy you're asking people to engage in?
Yeah, so we're specifically asking people to send emails to the federal lawmakers and ask them to put out a statement in support of the farmers. And again, ensure that the government in India knows that we are paying attention and critically paying attention, and that it is in all of our best interests to make sure that we support the farmers. And so it's an easy to use tool. You can also just text Punjab, PUNJAB to 52886. And it's just an easy to use tool to send those emails and build those relationships. I think it's also moments like this remind us of how important our own civil engagement is and how civic engagement is and how we build those relationships so that we can take a stand when we need to as well.
Have you heard back from any members of Congress? Has there been any kind of response?
Yeah, so 3 representatives that lead out on the Sikh caucus have sent a letter to the Indian embassy, and so has 1 senator. So we are seeing a response, a slow response, but an important response. We've also seen leaders from around the world putting out statements as well. A few folks, even here in the United States, have publicly put out support on social media platforms. But that has to continue, and we have to sustain that type of response because these protesters are set up for the long haul, and we have to protect them for the long haul.
Now, you did mention how cold it's getting in India now, and I think, tragically, I saw just before this that a couple of farmers and people who have been protesting have actually died as a result of the cold winter conditions. Some of them have frozen. This is obviously incredibly important to this community because they're continuing to do this during a pandemic, despite some of these like dire conditions. So where do you see this movement going in the next couple of weeks?
I think again, it's also important to acknowledge it's not just people who have died because of the cold, the harsh conditions, and just what's happening, but also died by suicide, which has been a really massive and critical problem for now decades for farmers in India across the country because they again have been facing so many challenges and have not gotten the attention that they deserve, and so they have been dying by suicide at astronomical numbers, and that needs to change. And so even during these protests, we've had some farmers who have again died by suicide too recently, very, very recently. And so just acknowledging that it's really critical for us as we are standing by, inspired by them, to also understand that the conditions are really hard for them, not just in this moment right now, but have been for a really long time. So yeah, in the short term, it's about supporting these protests and again, amplifying their voices as they're fighting for what they want. But in the long term, it is about helping creating systems all around the world, not just in India, but all around the world that better protect the working class, better protect small businesses, better protect the individual, and we start cutting back on the divide between the uber rich and the uber powerful and the everyday person.
Thank you again so much for joining us today to talk about what's going on. This isn't going away, right? This has been an issue, just as you were saying, for months and years now. So we will absolutely continue to cover this. Some of our producers at NowThis have been speaking to organizers on the ground in India, so we're looking forward to bringing you those interviews and that coverage as well. But as we sign off, can you tell our audience where they can go to learn more information and stay up to date on what the latest is?
Yeah, 100%. Hashtag farmers protest and just following on social media. This is a movement, not just by any one organization or any one individual. Definitely pay attention to social media channels of local organizers that are there. That is where you're getting the most accurate news and information. And I really encourage you to look at those sources first. And yeah, if you have questions specifically about work here in the United States, and we can help point you in direction of work that's happening here at sikhcoalition.org.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Of course, thank you. Have a great day.